What the world witnessed in the span of 6 hours last night will not be forgotten by anyone who is paying attention. Not because of the scale of destruction alone, but because of what it exposed about the actual distribution of power in the 21st century. 2,000 Iranian drones transformed the airspace above Tel Aviv into a corridor of fire, reduced 3 of Israel's most strategically significant military installations to burning wreckage, and sent the most formidable naval force ever assembled, accelerating away from the Persian Gulf in silence. This was not a skirmish. This was not a demonstration. This was a civilizational statement delivered in steel and precision that the era of unchallenged Western dominance over the Middle East has reached its terminal point. When the first wave of Shahed-136 and Shahed-238 platforms crossed into Israeli airspace at 217 inches. The morning, the operators at the Palmachim Air Defense Complex watched their tracking screens fill with contact signatures in a way none of them had ever seen. Not dozens, not hundreds, 2,000 simultaneous targets arriving from multiple vectors across a front, stretching from the Lebanese border to the Jordanian corridor. The sheer volume shattered every established protocol. Systems calibrated to handle saturation attacks of 60 to 80 targets simultaneously were now being asked to process a number 30 times beyond their design threshold. The algorithms buckled. The interception queues overflowed, and one by one, the gaps in Israel's celebrated defensive shield began to open. By dawn, the darkness hanging over Tel Aviv had nothing to do with the hour. Fires burning across the Gush Dan metropolitan corridor were visible from commercial aircraft over Cyprus. 3 major IDF command facilities had been rendered non-operational. The port infrastructure at Ashdod was paralyzed, and in the Gulf of Oman, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was executing a high-speed repositioning away from Iranian anti-ship missile range. Its course change tracked in real time by satellite imagery published within hours. The opening wave consisted of approximately 600 Shahed-136 Delta Wing loitering munitions routed deliberately through coastal terrain and valley corridors designed to compress radar acquisition time. Each carries a 40-kilogram warhead sufficient to destroy a radar installation or collapse a fuel storage structure with a single impact. Woven through that first wave were approximately 400 Shahed-238 variants, the jet-powered evolution that travels at nearly twice the speed of the baseline model. Where the original Shahed gives a defending system 4 to 6 minutes of engagement window from radar acquisition to potential impact, the Shahed-238 compresses that window to under 90 seconds. 90 seconds is not enough time for a human operator to confirm a track, authorize an engagement, fire an interceptor, and assess the result before the next target demands attention. The second wave launched 40 minutes later, entering from the northeast through corridors deliberately kept quiet in the preceding weeks to avoid triggering heightened alert postures along those vectors. By the time it arrived, Iron Dome batteries were already operating at reduced interceptor inventory from the first wave. The timing was not coincidental. It was the product of planning that had studied Israeli defensive reload cycles and scheduled the second strike to arrive at precisely the moment of maximum vulnerability. The third wave arrived as the defensive system was in a state of severe resource depletion. Multiple batteries had expended their ready-to-fire loads. The drones that penetrated during this final phase faced effectively no organized interception. They flew to their targets in near silence. The cost asymmetry driving Iran's strategic logic deserves precise attention. A Shahed-136 costs between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. A Tamir interceptor requires 2 rounds per target to achieve adequate kill probability, bringing the per engagement cost to $80,000 to $100,000. Against threats requiring aero engagement, the interceptor cost climbs to between $1 million and $3.5 million per round. Across 2,000 targets, the financial asymmetry runs into hundreds of millions of dollars in a single engagement. Israel's interceptor magazines are finite. American production lines replenish them on timescales measured in months. Every component of the Shahed family is domestically produced within Iran's own defense industrial base. 5 decades of comprehensive sanctions, technology transfer restrictions, and export controls did not prevent this development. They accelerated it by removing every alternative path and concentrating Iranian engineering talent on the single objective of building what external pressure was designed to prevent. The tools intended to guarantee Iran's strategic impotence became the primary motivation for achieving the capability that now confronts their architects. There is a category of strategic asset that appears on no procurement ledger and cannot be degraded by any sanctions regime. It is the conviction of a people who have decided, not as government policy, but as civilizational commitment, that they will not accept the subordination of their sovereignty to external powers, regardless of what resistance costs. The IRGC Aerospace Force soldiers who executed this operation were not fighting for a paycheck or a foreign policy abstraction. They were fighting for the proposition that their country, with its 4,000-year civilizational history, has the right to exist on its own terms without seeking permission from Washington or Tel Aviv. That motivation produces a quality of military performance that purely professional armies cannot replicate. It produces engineers who find solutions to technical problems that foreign procurement would solve more easily, because the alternative to finding those solutions is permanent technological dependency. It produces a national defense industrial base that builds functional precision strike capability under sanctions conditions specifically designed to make that impossible. The contrast between Israeli dependence on American resupply for every interceptor expended and Iranian self-sufficiency in producing the weapons it deploys is not merely an economic observation. It reflects 2 fundamentally different relationships between a state and its own security. A state that must ask permission from a foreign government to replenish its primary defensive munition has, at a deep structural level, outsourced its sovereignty along with its logistics. When that foreign government's carrier groups are repositioning away from the theater, the full implications of that outsourcing become impossible to ignore. At 4:03 the morning Gulf Standard Time, satellite tracking confirmed what American defense officials would spend the following hours carefully, not confirming publicly. The USS Abraham Lincoln had increased speed and altered course away from its operating position in the northern Gulf of Oman. What drove the decision was the activation of Iran's shore-based Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile batteries, a maneuvering re-entry vehicle system whose hypersonic terminal velocity and evasive final phase geometry pushes against the absolute limits of current naval air defense technology. Combined with Iranian naval assets conducting prepositioning movements in the immediate operating area, the tactical picture presented a multi-axis threat environment that the strike group's defensive architecture was not designed to absorb indefinitely. The decision to reposition was operationally rational, but every government on earth is now processing the image of an American carrier group withdrawing from a combat theater in response to Iranian military pressure against every future assessment of American security guarantees. The geopolitical architecture governing the Middle East since the Cold War rested on assumptions that were always more fragile than acknowledged. American military primacy was assumed to be indefinitely projectable. Israeli technological superiority was assumed to guarantee security outcomes regardless of threat scale. Every one of those assumptions was stress tested last night, and none survived intact. In Moscow, the repositioning of American carriers validates years of argument that American commitments are contingent rather than absolute. In Beijing, it strengthens negotiating positions across every relationship where American guarantees are a relevant factor. For the developing world that has spent decades navigating between American pressure and the aspiration for genuine strategic autonomy, last night constitutes a reference point of historic importance. The question now confronting every government watching these events is not whether the old order can be restored. It cannot. The question is, what kind of new order emerges from these ashes? Will Washington recalibrate toward a more honest assessment of what military power can and cannot accomplish in a world where asymmetric capability has closed the gap between superpowers and determined regional actors? The answers will not be written in diplomatic communiques. They will be written in decisions being made right now, in the hours after the fires, when the full weight of what this night means begins to settle. Drop your assessment in the comments, share this with someone who needs to understand what actually happened, subscribe to US Command Analysis. The next update is already in preparation.